Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by grants from Exxon Corporation, Allied Chemical Corporation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Good evening. This weekend, on Saturday to be exact, the presses were rolled for the last time on one of the country's oldest and most respected newspapers, the Chicago Daily News. Falling circulation and rising losses for the News will leave the nation's second largest city without an afternoon paper. That's becoming a familiar story around the country, as lifestyle changes are killing the appetite for afternoon journalism. In the last 20 years, many famous afternoon mastheads have disappeared. The New York Journal-American and New York World Telegram, the Hartford Times, Chicago Today, the Long Island Press, the Washington Daily News, and papers in Atlanta, Minneapolis, Phoenix, Tucson, Chattanooga, Newark, and Fort Worth. But there are other trends: the rapid growth of newspaper chains, the decline in cities with competing papers. Tonight, what's happening to American newspapers? Here's the former city editor of the Dallas Times-Herald.
Robin, the death of any newspaper is an occasion for mourning. Even the really lousy ones have somebody who reads them and depends on them for something, even if it's just regular companionship. But the death of the Chicago Daily News is special, at least to people who work or have worked on newspapers. The Daily News epitomized the old journalism, when stories were written on battered manual typewriters instead of computer terminals, when reporters drank heavily and dressed sloppily, when the idea of a great story was a murder trial, an execution, or corruption at City Hall, when, as novelist Meyer Levin, a Daily News X, says, you became a reporter to become an author, not something called a journalist. The Daily News had all of this from the day it first published 102 years and 2 months ago. It covered the death of Custer and the invention of the electric light, McKinley's assassination, the Wright brothers' first flight, and the other big stories through the years. It was also the paper of Finley Peter Dunn of Mr. Dooley fame, and Eugene Fields, who wrote Little Boy Blue and his other children's stories as a Daily News columnist, and Ben Hecht, who used Chicago newspapering as the model for his play Front Page. Carl Sandburg also wrote movie reviews for the Daily News, and most recently, it was the newspaper of Washington's Mr. Newspaperman, the late Peter Lisagor. The emphasis was always on good writing and clever leads, like this one the great newspaper man Robert J. Casey wrote in 1938 when a woman went on trial for murdering several husbands. Anna Marie Hahn's 11 husbands came to court today, 10 of them in glass jars and 1 in a blue serge suit. Theories vary on why the Daily News is folding. Some of the bitter ones in the city room blame it on bad management at the top. Others say it was a victim of the times of television in the suburbs, when people just don't read afternoon newspapers anymore. The Daily News that officially dies on Saturday is a much different Daily News than the one of the old journalism, but part of it was always there, and that's the part that will be missed the most, at least by old newspaper men. As they told us in journalism school back in the 50s, there are several good newspapers in this country, but only one real one, the Chicago Daily News. Robin?
The Chicago Daily News, as Jim said, survived for 102 years, but the oldest continuously published paper in the country is the New York Post. It was started by Alexander Hamilton in 1801. Former Post editor Paul Sann is a newspaperman in the traditional sense, rising from teenage copy boy to executive editor in 46 years. He covered every kind of beat, from City Hall to foreign wars, before leaving the Post last year to write more books. Mr. Sann, why are so many afternoon newspapers failing?
Well, I think the major reason, leaving apart television for the moment, a very big factor in the afternoon field is that you can't get the paper to the stand when your reader wants it. Let's say he's a stock market reader, or let's say he's looking for a race result. You can't deliver it in the traffic in the urban centers because there are no mayors with the guts to take the carbon monoxide out of your central areas. Never will be, probably. And besides that, a very important point I think a lot of people don't understand. You can't sell an evening newspaper in a high wind, in a rain, in a sleet, in snow, in cold. People won't stop and take their gloves off and reach into their pockets and get the money. You can't sell it to the man who is driving back and forth to work. He will not pull up at a newsstand and buy a paper.
And he can't read in his car.
He doesn't need it, because when he gets home, he's got Cronkite waiting for him with all the news in 3.5 seconds.
Some people suggest that as far as television is concerned, it isn't only television news programs, local or network, which are the competition for the afternoon paper, but just television entertainment, television itself.
Well, television journalism to me is not journalism except your show, you and your partner. But it does furnish information. It is furnishing more and more feature copy, amusement. It's telling you where to go and buy the best plate of spaghetti in town. It's telling you where there's a new belly dancer. And it's also telling you where the one-alarm fire is, which the newspapers have stopped printing because there are too many one-alarm fires. So the television journalism is something else. It wraps up everything. It also tells you that the president resigned. Now you know something big. It also tells you that a president got shot.
With all the difficulties that you described, weather, suburban commuting, everything else, why does your old paper, the New York Post, continue to flourish? Is New York just different?
Well, it's not different, but New York has 8 million people and is now down to 3 newspapers. It has a right to have a newspaper in the afternoon field. Well, it has 4. I forgot the Trib, which is really neither morning nor afternoon, but kind of a more aft, whatever you would call it. But there is room in this field, in a city of this size, for an afternoon newspaper if it can be published profitably and survive. We know that that's not that easy. In 62, 63, when the big strike happened here, 114 days, there were about 2 million people buying evening newspapers. That's down to 600,000 now. A lot of people got lost.
So the same effects are happening here, only because there are more people, it's just a little longer, taking a little longer, is that?
Yes, they're happening here as they are happening all over the country. The evening newspaper is the hard one to sell. The morning newspaper is automatic. You get up and you buy it and you find out what's happening. And you haven't got Cronkite there to tell you at 6 or 7 a.m.
Okay, we'll come back. Jim?
All right, despite the problems of some newspapers, particularly afternoon ones like the Chicago Daily News and others, the newspaper business generally is not a sick industry, anything but. Circulation and advertising revenues are generally on the increase, and so are net profits for most. When a newspaper changes hands these days, a lot of big money changes with it, along with the presses and the masthead. The Washington Star, the afternoon newspaper here, just sold to Time Incorporated for $20 million. Rupert Murdoch recently paid $30 million for Mr. Sann's ex-employer, the New York Post. and the newspapers in Wilmington, Delaware went in January for $60 million to the Gannett newspaper chain. But underlying those sales is a trend that some think is sick or may soon become so if it isn't reversed. And that's the move toward ownership of the nation's newspapers by groups or chains like Gannett, Time Incorporated, and the one headed by Murdoch. Latest figures show of the 1,762 daily newspapers in this country, 1,038, or two-thirds, are owned by groups or chains. One person who thinks this is a very unhealthy trend is Congressman Morris Udall, Democrat of Arizona, and he has introduced legislation in Congress designed to stem that tide. Congressman, what's the harm or the potential harm of chain ownership of newspapers?
Well, Jim, there's something very special here. The newspaper in your hometown was always and is always very special. It doesn't really matter too much that your tacos or your hamburgers or your hardware or your mufflers are sold to you by a chain. But it really matters that you don't have a hometown editor who's got roots in your community, whose kids go to your schools, who can blow the whistle on the crooked politicians and the promoters in town, who's there, part of the community. And if newspaper fraternity means anything, it means professionalism where the bottom line isn't everything. Sure, newspapermen wanted to make money in the old days and support their families. But so many of these big remote chains sitting off in some remote city 2,000 miles from your hometown, they look at the bottom line. It's the bottom line that counts. And if they're not making quite enough money, or if the profits aren't up, the tendency to cut out the sports coverage, the church coverage, the symphony coverage, the local coverage, the kind of things that local newspapers do when the publisher's part of the community and cares about it. This comes second, profits come first, and I'm troubled by it.
Are you saying that all locally owned newspapers are better than chain-owned newspapers?
No. In fact, when I made this first speech and stirred up the newspaper fraternity, one of the first letters I got was from a fellow in Manchester, New Hampshire, saying, Udall, you're right. What we need is good local, small, independent newspaper just like mine here in Manchester. And he's widely known for not running a very good newspaper. Sure, I can take you to communities where there's a chain and a local independent, and the chain beats them hollow. It's a much better paper.
Well,
but there's a principle here, and you can't answer my arguments by simply saying, sure, there's some good chains around. There are good chains around.
Well, I know in my situation, I worked on a locally owned newspaper, and that meant having a lot of local sacred cows, and that particular newspaper was bought by a chain, and overnight it became a much better newspaper.
Sure. But the ultimate thing we rest on in this country is diversity. If you got several thousand editors endorsing politicians, taking stands on public issues, you'll have some lousy ones, you'll have some people who are going wrong, and in the long haul, they'll all help us, the American people, to find the right way. But the day is coming, just mark my words, the day is coming with mergers and acquisitions, and you read about them in Editor and Publisher every week, when 10 or 12, 15 years from now, you're going to have just a few giant conglomerates, giant communications conglomerates, owning most of the newspapers that all the American people read. And you'll read in San Antonio the same thing you read in Richmond, Virginia, or Portland, Oregon. It'll all be one big homogenized mess, and we will have lost something very, very precious.
All right. Now, you have designed or you have introduced some legislation to do something about this. Tell us briefly what that would do.
Well, I've really got two bills. One is to have a competition review of all industry, including communications. Why is it? What in our tax laws, what in our system is promoting this threat to this move to conglomeration where a few big companies run this country? More importantly, I have said if we can save the family farm through tax legislation, as we did a couple of years ago, we can save the family newspaper. So I've introduced one bill, and this was what newspaper publishers who were telling me. They couldn't keep on going. They couldn't turn down the offers from the giant chains because the inheritance tax was killing them. You might be a third-generation newspaper family. You'd like to pass it on to your son or son-in-law. You can't do it because he can't come up with the inheritance tax. So my bill gives him extra time. Lets some of the profits of the company be taken and put in an advanced estate tax trust so that you will be able, those publishers, those fearless independent publishers who do want to pass it on to the next generation are not going to be prevented from doing it because of the tax laws.
All right. Thank you, Congressman. Robin?
One of the largest newspaper chains in the country is the Knight-Ridder Group, with 32 newspapers and a total of 6% of the country's daily newspaper circulation. The Chicago Daily News used to belong to the Knight half of that group. The president of Knight-Ridder is Alva Chapman. He's with us in the studios of public television station WPBT in Miami, where Knight-Ridder owns the Miami Herald and has its corporate headquarters. Mr. Chapman, what's your reaction to Congressman Udall's proposal?
Well, I think there's some merit in Congressman Udall's proposal in that any newspaper owner that is required to sell his newspaper by virtue of the estate tax requirements should be given some relief. But this is a problem that affects a number of business enterprises, not only newspapers. And I think that any relief of this kind that is considered should be considered for the owners of a number of individual enterprises rather than just newspapers exclusively.
Yeah. Do you see any dangers in the proposal?
Well, I do if it's tailored as it is simply to benefit newspapers, because there are a number of newspaper people that have some concern about any legislation regarding newspapers. What the government gives on one hand, it can take away with the other. The basic purpose of Congressman Udall's legislation has merit, but it probably could be extended to cover a number of business enterprises and not be tailored exclusively for newspapers. On that basis, I would feel very comfortable with it.
Do you have any sense of how it's doing in Washington?
I really don't. The bill, as I understand it, has not been heard by committee, and I'm really not aware of any status at this time.
If Mr. Udall's assumption is that chain concentration of ownership is bad for newspaper journalism to some degree, what is good about it? What advantages do chains bring, in your view?
Well, I think when you consider the newspaper business, it depends upon where you're starting, and the place to start, as I view it, is with the reader. And the question is, how is the reader best served? In many communities, with an individual local ownership, the reader is very well served indeed, and they have a good newspaper. However, the group ownerships have many opportunities to attract the best professionals, to get the best equipment, to provide the best facilities, and to produce the better newspaper. The reader is entitled to get the very best newspaper he can to help him be a good citizen, to help him live his life in his community. And we have in our company acquired some newspapers over the years that were not very good newspapers. And after spending a year or two working with those newspapers, they're a great deal better than they were, because the newspapers at the time did not have a state capitol bureau, did not have a bureau covering Washington, did not have a lot of the coverage that citizens need today in their local newspaper.
One frequent charge, or at least suspicion, about newspaper chains is that of monolithic editorial policy, the center telling all the editors what to print. How does it work in Knight Ridder?
Well, in Knight Ridder, that's not a problem. We believe very strongly in local autonomy. We have an independent editor for each newspaper, and he determines the editorial policy of that newspaper. And we believe in that, practice it, and have for many, many years. We would not have it any other way.
Would you say that any newspaper owned by a chain can serve a community as well as a local independently owned newspaper?
I think it could serve it better, because it can bring better facilities. Newspapers, to be good, need to be edited by competent professionals. And a group newspaper operation, in more cases than not, can attract the best professionals to be a part of the newspaper organization. The best editors, the best publishers, the best advertising directors, the best circulators. And the best people can produce the best newspapers. If you combine the best newspaper talent in America with the resources to get the job done, and you have a management that is committed to quality journalism, then the end result will be good newspapers, and the readers benefit. If the readers benefit, then the public is well served.
Congressman Udall, what's your reaction to that?
Well, the trend is what bothers me. Here it is, just pick up the Wall Street Journal or editor and publisher for the next month and see how many newspapers are bought up. And there's a further thing here, not just the concentration in newspapers, where it used to be the chains were buying up independent local newspapers. Now the chains are buying up chains. Mr. Knight ran a good chain, and the gentleman is a very good publisher, but they bought up Ridder. I'd like to ask him how many papers in the next 2 years, 3 years, 4 years they're going to buy up. How many television stations? How many book companies? Here's Time Life. They bought up the Book of the Month. They now bought up the Washington Star. They have newsprint facilities. They're into all kinds of communications business. And the day I dread is the day 10 or 15 years down the road, as this trend goes on, when 3 or 4 people sitting in some remote place will tell Americans what they're going to hear and read and see. And yes, today, Knight Ridder gives its editors autonomy. They don't tell them who to endorse. In fact, some of the good editors took on John Knight and endorsed other candidates on a local basis. But the day may well come when 3 or 4 or 8 or 10 people tell the American people so-and-so ought to be president. They control the channels of communication, and the job is done. And this is what worries me, is the trend.
Mr. Chapman? Can you answer this congressman's question, first of all? How many more papers is your group going to pick up in the next 2 or 3 years?
Well, we have no specific plans. We do contemplate some expansion We're very selective about the newspapers that we invite to be a part of our company. We're not at all interested in being the largest newspaper publishing company in America. We simply want to be the best. We want the newspapers that we do publish and the communities that we do serve to reflect our commitment to quality journalism. So we have no quota that we're planning to acquire 2 this year or 3 next year. No one sells a newspaper unless they want to sell it. If some individual who owns a newspaper and who actually desires to sell it and would like to affiliate with our company, then we would be interested in talking with them if it's the right size newspaper and the right kind of community. But size alone is not our objective. We're interested in publishing good newspapers and serving well the communities in which we are presently involved.
Mr. Sann, do you have opinions on the merits of the independent newspaper as it exists today versus the chain-owned newspaper?
Yes, I think there are what few independent newspapers left. There are some good ones. There are also very good chain newspapers, but the point that Mr. Udall makes about 15 years from now when 2, 3, or 4 guys are going to tell us everything is a little terrifying. I agree with him. I don't agree with him that the chain is so bad that it destroys the local newspaper because, as Mr. Chapman mentioned, there's a lot of autonomy. It operates very freely all over the country. It's not what it used to be when the big chain was Hearst.
Who told him?
Where
His editors what to do.
everybody said the same thing, and he better say it in the same words because otherwise the chief would call up. And he had a direct line from San Simeon. That isn't so anymore. The local newspaper, chain or otherwise, has enormous autonomy. The Newhouse chain is a perfect example of it. Every editor is an editor. And on local levels, they are doing what they want to do, and in many cases on national levels. There are chains which have split on which candidate to support for the presidency, that kind of thing. So that isn't altogether abominable, but Mr. Udall's point is a good one. 15 years from now, how many guys are going to be telling us what we're going to read, what features we're going to have, and so forth? That's a little terrifying, but it's down the road and nothing can stop it. You can't start an independent newspaper. There just isn't that much money in the world.
Thank you. Jim?
Mr. Chapman, what about that point of down the road 10 or 15 years ago, the point that Mr. Udall has made and that Mr. Sann has just agreed on, the terrifying aspects of it?
I don't think that'll come to pass. I think the economics will prevent that from occurring. I think there will be some expansion among the individual newspaper groups that are now in existence, but I don't think that there will be 10 or 15 companies that will own all the newspapers at that time. There are 32 editors in our company today who are deciding what will be the content of these newspapers tomorrow. And those are 32 professionals who live in these communities, who are dedicated to the welfare of their communities, and who want to publish the best possible newspaper for their readers.
But there's no question, is there not, Mr. Chapman, that that is the trend toward chain or group ownership, and that even though you may not agree with the consequences, that 10 or 15 years from now, the majority, almost all of the major newspapers in this country will be group or chain owned. Is that not correct if it continues at the rate it's going right now?
Well, I think you'll probably see some slowing down in the growth of the groups. The sheer economics will contribute to that. The ability to manage an enterprise with that many newspaper units will contribute to that. I think there's an optimum size. As far as we're concerned in our company, we're not interested in being the largest. We're not interested in acquiring newspapers simply for the business of acquiring more. We're interested in going into good markets where there's an opportunity there to serve the investment of our shareholders. But size alone is not what we're interested in. We're interested in quality and the overall ability to return on the investment of our shareholders.
Well, gentlemen, let's, in the few minutes we have left, let's talk about newspapers generally and the newspaper of the future, whether they be afternoon newspapers, morning newspapers, chain-owned, independent, or whatever. Is the basic function of the newspaper changing, and will it continue to change, Mr. Sann?
No, I don't think it's changing at all, except that it needs to change against the enormous competition that television presents.
Well, how is this manifested in a daily newspaper? What has television done to the paper that we get every day?
Well, television reads you the headline, And you need to have a pretty good newspaper to get somebody to go to a newsstand and buy it for 25 cents or 20 cents or 15 cents to tell you what really happened. Because basically the television news show is reading you headlines. And you need a newspaper to tell you what happened. What are the facts? Where is the interpretation? What is the depth of a story? That's a critical thing. And that will keep the newspapers alive for another several centuries because television isn't doing it. I don't say it can't do it, but it's not doing it. There aren't enough shows like this.
All right, well, Mr. Chapman, let me ask you, how do you think the newspapers of the future what shape will they take? Will they be basically what they're doing, or do you think there'll be any dramatic changes in the next few years?
I think we're already seeing dramatic changes. We're seeing more and more coverage of special interest items and special interest sections for our readers. Last year in our company alone, we came up with 150 new sections, new matters of special interest, everything from fashions to finance to weekend leisure to youth sections to senior citizen sections to cater to the special interest and needs of our readers. Now, this is all in addition to covering the basic news of the community and the state and the nation and international. But there are these special interests of our readers that are changing, and the newspapers have to change with them. Now, we have the flexibility to change now because typesetting is not the problem that it was 15, 20 years ago. We can set a lot of different kinds of type. We or even have the ability now to do extensive zoning so that the people in a certain neighborhood can get this kind of a newspaper rather than another kind. They get a newspaper tailored to their special interest.
Congressman Udall, as an avid and interested reader of newspapers, what changes have you seen recently, or and also looking ahead, do you think should be made in the American newspaper?
No, we'll always need newspapers. They can do, as has just been said, things television can't. The want ads, the fashion, the high school basketball scores, the stock market, the whole range of special information that we need in a diverse society. But I go back to what I'm concerned about before. Is this kind of information going to be fed to you by the same people who publish your books and put up your billboards and run your radio stations and run your television stations? Are we going to have this great kind of diversity that we've had in the past? And this is really what concerns me, because Jefferson said in diversity there is truth. And
the truth here is that we've got to go.
All right.
Robin?
I quit.
Yeah, well, that's it for tonight. Thank you very much, Mr. Chapman in Miami. Thanks, Congressman Udall. Good night, Jim.
Good night, Robert.
Thank you, Mr. Sann. That's all for tonight. Jim Lehrer and I'll be back tomorrow night. I'm Robert MacNeil. Good night.
For a transcript, send $1 to the MacNeil-Lehre Report, Box 345, New York, New York, 10019. The MacNeil-Lehre Report was produced by WNET and WETA. They are solely responsible for its content. Funding for this program has been provided by this station and other public television stations, and by grants from Exxon Corporation, Allied Chemical Corporation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.